just so you do understand that everything here is going to be seen later. We also think it's important to model the things that we want, or we model the things that we think are important for the educational experience. One of those being, if you are hosting a synchronous event, it's definitely a good idea to let your students know if they are being recorded. It's just, an ethical and an important thing to do. I'm excited though. Let's go ahead and jump in. I want to let you know that there are several ways that you can participate in this workshop. Since we had such a high number of people that said they wanted to be involved, we needed to move to WebEx, or to a web events format, rather than kind of the traditional workshop event that we normally use. Because of this, the ways of participating are a little bit different. If you have a question, please do feel free to put it in the chat box. Elizabeth has been doing an incredible job of monitoring that and making sure that everyone on this side knows if there's questions, and summarizing some of the great discussion that's going on behind the scenes. Also, if you are just kind of wanting to keep things to yourself, the slides have been emailed to y'all. Please feel free to use those to take notes. Along, or in an earlier email, we also sent you a link to a crowdsourcing document. If you click on that link, it's a live document. You can keep your notes on there. It's a way that everybody that is participating can kind of add, fill in gaps, and together we can all learn from one another through the notes that are being kept. We also want to make sure that if you are designing as we go, and if you are designing as we go in a shareable document, you can upload that link and we can actually project that so other people can see the great work that you're doing. And once we put this in the CTL online organization area, there will be a discussion forum connected to it. So please do take advantage of any means of participation you want. We look forward to seeing your thoughts and getting a fun and exciting sense of the things that with what we're working with in these workshops. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump right in. The goals for today are pretty straightforward. We want to talk about how outcomes can help define and design a course experience. We want to illustrate how agile formative assessment can really help in success tracking for students. And we want to just talk about ways that you can define productive class assessment practices, and the way specifically how you can move between the different environments in order to be to create agile assessment practices. Dr. Huska, please jump on in.
So like so many things, these are the desired outcomes or intended learning outcomes. By the end of this session, we hope that you'll be able to do all three of those. So keep that in mind, and by all means, if you have questions at this session or afterward, please contact the Jeremys. We're here for you.
Nice. All right, so one of the things we want to do is we want to start off with a chance for you to reflect and respond. So wherever you are taking notes, and however you are choosing to keep track of the things that you're doing in these workshops, there's going to be spaces where we say, take 3-5 minutes to just stop, think, and capture your thoughts. The purpose of this is not only to provide breaks, but also to kind of model how we can allow space for our students to process the different things that they're doing in the course. If we're just tossing a bunch of information at students and really plowing through, it can be easy to quickly forget what's going on. So as part of this process, we're going to start with this first reflect and respond moment, and we'll go with 3 minutes. If you would please just answer these questions. When you hear the word assessment, what do you think? And likewise, when you're curious about what your students are learning, how do you find out?
And be honest.
It's definitely exciting to see the way that people are thinking about assessment in this regard. I know One of the couple of the things, and Jeremy, please jump in as well. A couple of the things I noticed that were great is understanding that assessment and evaluation are very different things. Assessment is about learning, evaluation is often about grades. And it's also exciting to see that there's such a positive connection with assessment rather than some of the experiences I've heard about or seen where assessment has been a four-letter word, we'll say.
Yeah, and one of my colleagues, at least in the psychology circles, Eric Landrum, used to say that assessment is personal, right? Because it's about me, it's about my students, my teaching and whatnot. And a couple of you mentioned assessment is information about teaching and learning. And how do you know when your students are learning? There are certainly better ways to determine that through direct performances and whatnot, but that's never to discount asking them what they're learning, how much they've gained, and so on. So I was glad to see both indirect and direct measures of learning. This comment box is blowing up. Thank you.
When Jeremy and I were talking about this particular workshop, we wanted to really focus on the why of assessment. What's it all about? What's the purpose of assessment to begin with? The simple answer, I mean, if you say, why do we assess, is, well, I care about the student experience. Assessment is a way of actually digging into what's going on in the courses, to digging into what's going on with those students. Simple answer number two is, I care about student learning. It can be really easy to jump into the classroom and say, okay, I'm here because I just want to tell you all about what I know about this thing. Teaching does not equal learning, unfortunately. And so the beauty of assessment is it can really help us understand what the students are actually taking away from their time with us.
Difference between message transmitted and message received.
I think one of the most important parts of what assessment is, though, and why we should care about assessment is if you want to be a better teacher, assessment is the place to start.
Right. And I've found that the more we do it, the more we have these conversations, as some of you said in the chat box about, how's the class going? How's my teaching? What could I do better? What are you learning? It becomes a lot easier, and then students will automatically do that for you and help you get better, at least in my experience.
I mean, we briefly touched on why assessment is important, but it's also important to talk about what assessment actually is. I mean, we know what assessment isn't, but what is assessment? Proper assessment isn't controlling. And this is one of those places where it's easy to kind of fall back into this idea of assessment is about being monitored. But truly, if it's good assessment and if it's a strong environment based on learning from what we're doing, we aren't being controlled, we're growing together. Proper assessment is about inquiry. It's not about, once again, it's not about protocol. It's not about measurement for the sake of measurement. It's about asking a meaningful question and then digging in. It's about understanding what is going on with your students and how to better ensure that they're getting what they need out of their educational experience. Proper assessment values student learning. It's easy to I mean, as crazy as it sounds, there are times where assessment done not because it's meaningful assessment doesn't really care about the student learning. It just cares about being able to document or being able to show some sort of thing for some other group. But if we're really digging into this, it's because we care about the student learning. And proper assessment values student voices. The students are a meaningful part of the assessment process.
And I'll just emphasize that students do provide very, very valuable feedback as long as we give them the parameters and tasks for which they're most qualified. For instance, if we talk about classroom feedback on your instruction, they see you and they observe your class more than any of your colleagues do. So this is just another example of how that student voice is so critical, and it challenges us, whether it's norming our rubrics, refining our assignments, to find ways to get informal student feedback to improve. And just wanted to emphasize Jeremy's point about assessment as inquiry. We're all scholar teachers. We want to learn. We want to know how our students are doing, how we're doing. Assessment as compliance doesn't help any of us. So I hope that we keep adhering to assessment as inquiry, and assessment is about learning.
So as we continue our questions about what assessment actually is, we can see assessment as something that provides a map for learning. It's something that helps guide the development, but also something that helps us track our progress. Assessment provides landmarks for learning, where we can see, are we on the right track, or did we lose our way? Assessment also provides a way to ask questions if we get lost. And this is an important one. If you're using assessment as a way to establish common meaningful language with your students, it provides a conversation starter, not a conversation ender. So this is another place where we want to give you a chance to sit back and think for a little bit. We're going to go with about 3 minutes to reflect and respond, but really take a look at these questions. What is outcome-oriented design? What's the benefit of thinking about learning in parts? And how does this connect to course assessment? Take a few minutes to consider those things. I'm really impressed with Nancy Jarman-Dunn's answer in there, saying that we need to really understand what we're asking of students if we are going to assess them. Jeremy, you were gonna add something in there that was really important as well.
Yeah, so in that second question, what's the benefit of thinking about learning in parts? Another way of thinking about that is, modular design, just designing your course by modules. And I did that with a textbook. So instead of just having a chapter with objectives, the content, maybe some review questions, what I did intentionally was, in our textbook, had a vignette. Why did we tell students? Why did we tell students that story? Gave the content for the module. What's the take-home message? And then some action steps to apply the information that we presented, and then the references for that module, right? And the reason I did that was to help students focus on material instead of a whole chapter. It allows instructors to really customize what they're doing in the classroom, and really started thinking about, if we were to organize by a modular approach, that's going to help instructors think about assessment. Right? So I wasn't sure if anybody was making that connection with modular design and assessment, but that's one of my key reasons for why we designed our textbook that way.
So we've kind of dug into some of the whys, but now we need to really dig into the how. What does assessment look like? How do you accomplish it? What do you do? Jeremy, do you want to speak to this one real quick a little bit?
Sure. So our first point that we're presenting here, our courses are part of an intentional plan. And many of the groups that we're working with, and those of you who are conducting program review or thinking about it, that's where your curriculum map comes in, right? How do the courses fit together to introduce an outcome, reinforce an outcome, master it? So a curriculum map is a tool to help us do that, right? Also, think about a first day, first term student. What do they come in with? What don't they come in with? And then how do you construct your curriculum and learning experiences to add value? And of course, from an assessment standpoint, where do you actually capture that growth? Somewhere in the middle of the curriculum, and then of course at the end, right? Thinking about what differences there are and what the student will know, think, and do with a graduating student, right? So what are those differences? Think about proficiency levels, and a number of our committees and task forces were thinking about that. And this is critically important for both grad programs as well as adult learners. And there's a lot of tools out there in the assessment circles, whether it's curriculum maps with proficiency levels, the introduced, developed, mastered idea, curriculum maps with links to the assignments and rubrics and all of that. All of those types of activities help you think about where your classes will fit in this transformation, and it will allow you to evaluate, really, do the learning experiences, are they sufficient to get students where they need to be at graduation? So as I was thinking about this, a lot of the tools that we're using will get us there.
I think a crucial point that you make as well is that we really need to stop and think about where our students are when they come into their experiences with us. And so this is one of the reasons why I challenge you to keep track of the different reflections that you have, keep track of the different things that you've thought about, particularly in the first workshop when we said, you know, who are your students? What characteristics did they bring? What assets do they bring? How can we use those assets to develop a collaborative and co-created relationship with our students? Understanding who they are when they come in will definitely help us to create that intentional plan and to create that intentional structure. So we're going to take just 2 minutes on this one. And we're going to ask that you reflect and respond once again, that you take a look at your course goals and look at how those goals are building towards program goals or institutional goals. And ask, what are you using in order to show that the learning is taking place? How are you monitoring students' processes?
So that sounds like that's the conclusion of our reflection time, Jeremy, isn't it?
Yes.
All right. So just very quickly, I'm currently in the WASC Assessment Leadership Academy, and we've been talking about some of these issues. And that third question actually can be used pretty strategically. And what I mean by that is, if you're looking to restart or reboot a stalled assessment progress, or it's been a while since you've collected data, that's a fundamental question. What evidence do you have that can show the learning taking place, right? So if you're looking at particular outcomes, just ask the instructors, where might we find the evidence? Where might we find the learning, right? So feel free to use that question. And on the next slide, I wanted to also encourage you to think about how this schematic looks. And let me walk you through it quickly. At the very bottom, you see your course level SLOs. And then a level above, you have your PLOs, your program level learning outcomes. And in some cases, at some institutions, you have your general education learning outcomes. Those are separate outcomes. They're not baccalaureate or institutional. They're just for general education. What should students be able to do as a result of this general ed curriculum? And then you go up another level, you see at some institutions they have both undergraduate or baccalaureate learning outcomes, as well as graduate learning outcomes, and in this case the GRLOs, right? And not all institutions have these, but the institutional learning outcomes or strategic planning initiatives that speak to learning. So what does this look like? Well, it looks like a coherent curriculum if everything's aligned, but that's not always the case at every institution. So just putting that up there for us to think about moving forward as an institution, whether we have the alignment between our course and our program, and also some of those missing boxes. Does that make sense for the University of La Verne moving forward? So I look forward to having those conversations next year with many of you. Anything else on that, Jeremy?
No, I think that that's definitely an important conversation for us all to take up and think about just where are we in what we're doing.
Yeah, and just in terms of Bloom's taxonomy from an assessment standpoint, I've definitely used that in several initiatives lately with General Ed as well as LVE, and then in the WASCA Academy, we've talked about using Bloom's taxonomy to really help guide what students should be able to do or demonstrate, right? And Bloom's taxonomy is very helpful in terms of getting measurable verbs. And once we're all speaking that common language, I think it will also help us understand developmentally what types of learning outcomes we're having for our various courses, right? Bloom's really gives us some suggestions about what might be good levels of learning to demonstrate in a 100 level class versus a 200 and 300 or an upper division. So Bloom's has been a big help.
And this is definitely something that's going to be taken up a lot more as we go throughout the rest of the workshops. In particular, in Elizabeth's workshop on communication, Bloom's taxonomy provides a language that makes it much easier to be transparent, where you are making it clear to your students what you're actually asking them to do, which allows you to then begin to talk with them about why it's significant, why they should care, and how they can actually be successful. Now, I think it's important that we really do dig into the different types of environments as well. In this morning's workshop, we talked about the 3 different environments, one being face-to-face, where there's a physically shared experience. You're all in the same room at the same time. We also talked about a synchronous experience, where it's temporally shared. You may not be in the same room at the same time, but you're in a space together, even if it's a virtual space. But then you have an asynchronous environment in which the time-based signals aren't present. And so these need to be created. It needs to be intentionally developed so students understand where they're at in the experience and how to move forward. This is going to be really important as we continue to think about where we're going next, because in those temporally guided experiences, it's easy to assume that there's a shared understanding when there isn't. And that's one of the reasons why we're carrying forward with this idea of design for online and then use to enhance. If you're carefully designing your educational experience, if you're being truly transparent, inclusive, and if you're being very, very intentional, it becomes much easier for these processes that you would use to signal where you're at in that experience to create that shared understanding. It becomes you're able to use that to enhance your face-to-face environments. You're able to use that to enhance your synchronous environments. It provides you with a chance to see the student learning between the environments. You know, basically, by designing for online, you can start to say, okay, what's going on here, what's going on there, and if we do end up in a situation that's a little bit more towards a high flex, this is going to be an important thing to do. Another capability of this is it allows you to adapt as is needed instead of waiting until the end of the course when you're hopefully trying to make changes for the students to come. It allows you to make changes for the students you have. And even more specifically, by really designing for online and particularly the assessment practices, this can save us time. This can save us effort, because the quality feedback, the things that we tell our students, the way that we work with our students, it becomes much more intentional, becomes much clearer, much more transparent. And so we aren't scrambling at the end of the course to try and get people caught up or to explain things that we thought our students understood to begin with.
Yeah, And as Jeremy and I were discussing this with the phrase "design for online," what really resonated with me is you can really create a lot more structure, increase structure online, and that's certainly better than prepping for a face-to-face course that's a little looser in structure. I kind of feel like it's at the start of a semester you're stricter and then you loosen up, right? It's the same type of thing here. If there's not an outcomes focused and there's not increased structure, you may need to build that on the fly or during the semester, and that might be even more stressful. So I think this approach helps us on many levels.
Sorry, that slide was clearly in the wrong place. So we're going to jump right on there. So what do you do? What do you do here? How do you do this? It's going to be important to start by reviewing the outcomes. Not every outcome is going to work equally in all the different environments. So it's going to be important to stop and think about what are the differences between the different environments in terms of outcomes and the way they plan out. So we're going to take another couple minutes here. We're going to ask you to reflect and respond. Specifically, we would like to know what impacts you see regarding the learning environments and how you achieve and measure your goals. Take 2 minutes. And truly, if the goal is to find ways of moving in between and working around all the different types of environments, it's going to be important that we are honest with ourselves about the different impacts we see. And that we begin to say, okay, what do we need to do? How do we need to act, react, and how can we be intentional with what we're trying to accomplish? So what does this actually look like? So if we're going to process an example, let's consider the way that these environments impact how you check for understanding. Jeremy, do you want to talk a little bit about the concept check and the way that you and I were taught to think about it?
Sure. So as I was teaching a bunch of face-to-face courses, started about 12 years ago, it was face-to-face paper versions of concept checks, so quick minute papers to see if students are getting the concept or what we wanted them to get out of the activity. Because I found that I can't just look at them and understand if the light bulb went off or not. Sometimes they're nodding and they're smiling, and that's just being nice. So I realized that I needed to do a little bit more and actually get some direct evidence of whether they're learning. Not the feeling of knowing or feeling of learning, as some of you noted in the chat, but some actual evidence. Low stakes doesn't count for points. So how does that translate into an online course that's synchronous or asynchronous?
Yes, this is definitely going to be an important where we start to think about how we gather this information, especially if we can't actually see our students. How do we go about understanding what they're taking away and what we need to do to adapt to enhance their student or to enhance their experience in their learning? So concept checks are definitely a fun kind of, well, a CAT as a lot of people talk about it, classroom assessment technique. They gauge the level of student understanding, and it really helps to get a sense of where your students are at in the course. Concept checks, there's a lot of ways that you can do them. I'm sure you've heard about minute papers. I'm sure you've heard about muddiest points. I'm sure, there's a lot of even just think, pair, share types of things that you can do in real time when your students are right there in front of you. But we need to stop and think about what this would look like in a different environment. Now, before we jump into this, let's stop and recall what we talked about with think. One of the things that Fink talks about in creating moments of significant learning is helping students learn how to learn, helping students learn what types of questions are important to ask. And so this is one of the ways that a concept check can be very, very beneficial, because you are modeling to them what types of questions to ask. You're modeling for them how someone in the field is going to approach a concept, an experience, or something along those lines. And so let's stop and think then, drawing on Fink and making formative assessment a meaningful part of the learning experience. Let's be creative on how we can do that. Likewise, we have Kolb. Kolb's concept, as we talked about, is a way of reframing reflection as an empirical process, where basically you're getting your students to ask questions, analyze the thinking and the learning, which in all honesty gives you great insight into what's going on in their minds. If you explain or bring up a concept and ask students to apply it and they can't, that means maybe you need to stop, rethink, dig back in, and go over things again before anything falls apart. Likewise, then you can ask students how to make changes to the processes, or how to do things a little bit differently. And this, once again, helps to guide them in disciplinary ways of thinking. Asking students then to make those changes can empower students as they see that they play a role in their own learning, and that they have the chance to do things. They have the chance to make changes and to grow. And then, once again, asking your students to analyze the result, that's going to be an important part of the process. Going through this reflective act, this becomes an act of assessment within greater acts of assessment. So drawing on the things we've talked about before, the Bloom, the Finks, and Kolb, these can help you to move forward in a very intentional way in terms of your in-class assessment and your assessment of the class as a whole.
Right. This corresponds very closely with your classic assessment cycle. So, yeah. So back to the concept checks idea. What does checking for understanding look like in different environments? So here are just some examples of questions. How would you apply this concept if, and then you change the context? Something very timely. Where have you seen this in the news? Those of you who use discussion boards on the learning management system Blackboard, you could also do that, even for a face-to-face course. Some of you might have used text-based clickers, if you will, or pull everywhere. I will also share that the idea measure, that whole interface, has instant feedback. That's something I'd like to pilot over the summer and into the fall. So if any of you are doing classroom assessment techniques and want to try idea, let me know. I'd love to get you on the pilot team.
So let's take a couple minutes to respond and reflect. How do you normally stop to see if your students are actually getting it? How could you take your favorite technique and do it in a different environment? And how could that help you enhance the learning in your face-to-face interactions? Let's take a couple minutes to consider those questions, please. Nice. Once again, there's a lot of great stuff that's coming in on the chats, and it's wonderful to see just how intentional and how careful you're being about how you're checking with your students, which is a beautiful thing. I can tell you that I had to one of the experiences I had that really taught me a lot about teaching and a lot about doing checks in different environments was when I needed to move an advanced public speaking course into an online environment. I'll tell you what, if you need to figure out how you can better assess what your students are taking away in the moment, that's one class that will push you to the edges.
When I was a graduate student teaching assistant, I remember having big classes in an auditorium where I'd have students hold up a certain color that corresponded with a multiple choice response, and that gave us a good visual of how people were grasping things. But as I've looked in the chat box, A good approach, I think Kim mentioned it, Kim Mitchell, about putting down a number or a letter as you're going on. That's a quick concept check and a good gauge of student opinion too. So I definitely think we can be creative with that in the Zoom rooms. I think Shannon mentioned that. I think there's a lot of potential there.
So one of the things that assessment can do, particularly in the way that we're talking about, is it gives you a chance to not only create a learning map for you and your students, but to figure out what to do or when things are starting to go in the wrong direction particularly quickly. The worst thing that can happen is for us to assume that everybody's on the same page and then 4 weeks in figure out that wasn't the case and then have to try and figure out how to get all our students caught up. This is a big part of inclusive design, understanding where your students are at, understanding how to make sure everyone's moving forward together, and then also applying some of those universal design functions where you are saying, okay, if I know this is going to be an issue, if I know this is going to be a pinch point, how can I move my students along this map so we're all progressing together?
Yeah, and I think the whole idea of tracking success along the way is absolutely key. One experience some of us might have had is we taught some difficult concept and everybody missed it on the midterm, or we weren't checking along the way, and by the time on the final we had students perform a little lower than we would have expected. Or if we look at a curriculum and we're only assessing in a 400 level class, we're not able to see how students are doing along the way and make that U-turn, as Jeremy noted. So success tracking or tracking of student learning, whatever wording you use, absolutely key.
So the nice thing about this is if we're kind of checking in with our students at various specific points, particularly if we're using kind of a modular approach or breaking our learning into either sections based on concepts, sections based on projects, or just other ways of creating units, it provides nice, even places where you can check with your students to say, how are things going? You know, what's working well? What do we need to change? This is a really important thing, is it allows you to adapt to the students that you have. It allows you to show your students that you are listening to them and that you're trying to do everything you can to make sure that that they're getting it and that they're getting out of the experience what's going to be important. It also can help provide you with an opportunity to help your students make connections. In terms of assessment and in terms of, you know, moving your students forward, when I'm asking students, you know, what they're taking away from the experience, what jumped out at them, what's working well, what's not, I also ask them, how are they going to use these concepts outside of the class? How are they going to apply them elsewhere? And that gives me a really good check as well of what the students are doing, what they're seeing is important, and where they are making connections that I'm hoping they make, and where I need to reinforce the learning to help them establish patterns of thought that are going to be important elsewhere. So once again, what does this look like in different environments?
Instead of all the paper, right? Online surveys have been a big help, whether you use Google Forms or Qualtrics. Either way, that can translate across environments.
Another important thing about the assessment practices that we're discussing, particularly the formative assessment, is that it allows you to kind of take a look at what's going on at the class level. It allows you the opportunity to provides you with an opportunity to discuss systemic inequity. I mean, this is an important discussion to have with our students right now. Likewise, it gives you a chance to, once again, make meaningful changes for the time you have with not only the students you have right with you, but to think about how you're going to improve things for the students that you're going to have later.
Yeah, and I think the more discussions you have about paying it forward for future Leos or your brothers and sisters in the major that will come after you, I think definitely helps build value for assessment and these types of activities. And consequently, that's why we do that with the idea a student feedback measure right now in the pilot. So I think any way you can convince students of doing that frequently, I think would help.
Once again, there's a lot of great things that are coming through the comment box. I can't wait to kind of when we get to pull this together and put these on the shared crowdsourced notes. A lot of fun ways to check in with your students. So in terms of checking in at the class level, this is another way or another place where it can easily be done asynchronously. It doesn't have to be done with everybody there at the moment filling out forms or doing things at the same place at the same time. In fact, you sometimes are going to get better feedback from your students when they can sit back and think about it and consider exactly what they want to say. And when you have the chance to really talk with them about what the feedback means, how it's going to be used. And I would make the case that we also need to stop and talk with our students about the ways that feedback can be misused and the ways that biases can be injected into the process so that we can really work with our students to understand what we're trying to do and how to be better at improving the educational process. I wanted to give just a side note on Kolb. As we talked about earlier, Kolb is a great way of helping your students kind of fill in the gaps, helping your students to go through an assessment process or an assessment loop. But it's also a good way for us to show how we are closing the loop, how we are reflecting on our classroom experiences, reflecting on what we're doing, and making meaningful changes to what's going on in our courses, how we are improving our educational environments. So, what are the benefits of assessment? What do you think? What should we do?
Well, involving students in assessment is something that I'm learning is rare in institutions of higher education. We ask students to provide data, but we don't always discuss what those data reveal, how we're using the data, and thanking students for that. Um, Actually, going through that process also conveys to students that they're being heard and their voice is valuable.
It also really reinforces not only that they can be heard, but that they should be heard. That we should be asking our students what's going on, that we should be checking in with them, and that we should be paying attention to what their needs are and how we can better support their learning, how we can better uh, adapt, and how we can make our decisions in a more agile, flexible, and intentional way.
I think this is the kicker, isn't it, Jeremy?
Mm-hmm.
This whole process and all that we do, we should be doing it already, or as we learn about it, we should want to do it. As I mentioned earlier, assessment is personal. It's about me and my teaching and how my students are learning, and then we can expand and extrapolate to how we're doing it as an institution. And one of the exciting things is continuing to grow. That's why we're in a learning community in higher ed, right? If we aren't willing to keep learning, how can we ask others to actually do so?
Elizabeth, have there been any questions in the chat box that we should address?
It's been actually a lot more discussion taking place, and I'm seeing a lot of faculty supporting faculty, which is beautiful. One of the points that came up was the need for making sure that there's consistency from semester to semester when you have areas where you need to go deeper, meaning it will require more time to get those deeper understandings of the content that's being covered. And so, do you guys have any comments on how that might be able to be addressed?
But just from my side of it, it sounds like a great chance for a program to do some SOTL work, so do some scholarship of teaching and learning to kind of monitor and ask how are our students progressing across the program? How are they moving through, and where are the places where they're really growing? Where are the places where some of them are being held back? Jeremy?
Yeah, I think it would help a deeper dive, definitely into some SOTL, or it may even be a faculty assessment fellowship project. So if you didn't receive the email from Daniel Bird yesterday to campus, there will be a handful of assessment fellows, and if you're interested in looking at issues like that, please email me. I can give you some more details and perhaps guide you a little bit more toward that application process. Again, see that email from Daniel yesterday for more details.
Are there any other questions, friends? Well, it's definitely been exciting to see some of the things that have been discussed in the chat. It's been wonderful to see such positive connections with assessment. It's great to get a feel for where everyone's at, and to see that maybe here at La Verne, assessment isn't a dirty word. So we're gonna, once again, thank you for watching this. If you have any other questions, please do feel free to contact us at ctl@laverne.edu. If you have questions for Jeremy Huska, we can pass them on, or you can email him directly. I will be, once again, I do not feel like it's ever necessary to take more time than is needed. So since things have progressed well, thank you all for joining us today. I look forward to chatting with you more in the workshops tomorrow, Monday, and Tuesday. Have a wonderful evening, everyone, and we'll see you soon.